Today, we'll explore 10 scientific theories that faced systematic suppression and ridicule before eventually being vindicated by history. These discoveries reveal something deeply troubling about how scientific progress actually works. The truth isn't always welcomed with open arms. Sometimes it has to fight for its very existence against institutions that claim to champion knowledge, but actually guard against revolutionary change. The first theory that was supposedly too dangerous to reveal involves the very ground beneath our feet. For centuries, geologists maintained an unshakable belief in a static Earth. The continents were fixed in place, immovable monuments to divine creation. This wasn't just scientific doctrine, but theological certainty. To suggest that massive land masses could drift across the planet's surface was to challenge the fundamental order of creation itself. Into this rigid orthodoxy stepped a German meteorologist whose background in atmospheric sciences made him an outsider to the geological establishment. His training in weather patterns and polar exploration had given him a unique perspective on global phenomena that traditional geologists lacked. When he began examining world maps and geological formations, he noticed something that others had overlooked or dismissed as coincidental. The coastlines of distant continents seemed to fit together with remarkable precision. South America and Africa appeared to be pieces of an enormous puzzle that had somehow been separated. But the evidence went far deeper than superficial similarities in shoreline contours. Identical fossil species appeared on continents separated by vast oceans. Creatures that could never have survived oceanic journeys were found in matching rock formations thousands of miles apart. Even more compelling were the geological signatures that told impossible stories. Tropical plant fossils emerged from Arctic ice, while glacial scarring marked desert regions that had never seen snow. Coal deposits from ancient swamps appeared in locations that were now frozen wastelands. Mountain ranges on separate continents showed identical rock compositions and formation patterns that suggested they had once been connected. The meteorologist compiled this evidence into a comprehensive theory, proposing that all continents had once formed a single supercontinent. Over millions of years, this massive landmass had gradually broken apart, with the pieces drifting to their current positions like icebergs on a slow-moving sea. He called this ancient supercontinent by a name that would become famous, though not in his lifetime. When he presented his continental drift theory to the geological community, the reaction was swift and merciless. The president of America's most prestigious philosophical society declared the idea to be complete nonsense. Geologists on both sides of the Atlantic united in their condemnation, dismissing the theory as the delusional fantasy of someone who clearly didn't understand real Earth sciences. The criticism wasn't merely academic disagreement, but personal attack. The meteorologist was branded a pseudo-scientist whose ideas belonged in fairy tales rather than serious journals. His lack of formal geological training was used to discredit not just his theory, but his competence to comment on Earth sciences at all. The establishment treated him as a dangerous amateur whose wild speculations threatened the credibility of legitimate research. The fatal weakness in his argument was the absence of a mechanism. While his evidence for past continental connections was compelling, he couldn't explain what force could be powerful enough to move entire continents across the Earth's surface. His suggestions about rotational forces and gravitational effects were quickly demolished by calculations, showing they were far too weak to accomplish such massive displacement. Without a credible explanation for how continental drift could occur, the geological establishment felt justified in rejecting the entire theory as an interesting collection of coincidences that proved nothing. The meteorologist's careful documentation of fossil patterns, rock formations, and geological structures was dismissed as selective evidence gathering that ignored contrary data. For decades, continental drift remained the textbook example of how seemingly compelling evidence could lead to completely wrong conclusions. Students learned about it as a cautionary tale about the importance of understanding physical mechanisms before proposing grand theories. The meteorologist's name became synonymous with brilliant but misguided speculation. The vindication came from an unexpected source during humanity's darkest global conflict. Military submarines navigating the ocean depths to hide from enemy vessels began systematically mapping the seafloor with unprecedented precision. What they discovered beneath the waves would completely transform our understanding of how the planet actually works. The ocean floor wasn't the smooth, ancient surface that scientists had imagined. Instead, it revealed a dynamic landscape of massive underwater mountain ranges, deep trenches, and geological features that suggested constant activity. Most dramatically, they found evidence that the seafloor itself was spreading outward from central ridges, creating new oceanic crust in a continuous process. Magnetic analysis of seafloor rocks revealed alternating patterns that recorded millions of years of the Earth's magnetic field reversals. These magnetic stripes provided a perfect chronological record, proving that oceanic crust was indeed moving, spreading outward from mid-ocean ridges in both directions. The evidence was undeniable and revolutionary. Suddenly, the continental drift theory had its missing mechanism. The continents weren't ploughing through solid ocean crust as critics had mockingly suggested. Instead, they were passengers riding on massive tectonic plates that were being pushed and pulled by convection currents deep within the Earth's mantle. The seafloor spreading was the engine that drove continental movement. By the 1960s, the once ridiculed theory of continental drift had been reborn as the unifying principle of plate tectonics. Every geology textbook was rewritten to accommodate this new understanding of planetary dynamics. The meteorologist who had died decades earlier, his reputation in ruins, was posthumously recognized as a visionary who had seen the truth decades before the technology existed to prove it. The transformation was complete and humbling. The same evidence that had been dismissed as meaningless coincidence was now celebrated as brilliant insight. The man who had been branded a pseudo-scientist was revealed to be a prophet of geological understanding. The theory that was supposedly too radical to be taken seriously became the foundation of modern Earth sciences. This pattern of initial rejection, followed by eventual vindication, would repeat itself throughout the history of scientific discovery. The next theory we'll examine faced even more systematic suppression because it threatened not just scientific orthodoxy, but the very foundations of religious and philosophical authority. The stakes were higher, the opposition more powerful, and the consequences for those who dared to challenge conventional wisdom far more severe. The challenge to humanity's place in the cosmos began with a quiet canon who spent his nights calculating the movements of celestial bodies. For over 15 centuries, Western civilization had operated under an unshakable cosmic certainty. Earth stood at the center of all creation, with every star, planet, and celestial object revolving around our world in perfect crystalline spheres. This wasn't merely an astronomical model, but the cornerstone of theological doctrine and philosophical understanding. The geocentric system represented humanity's ultimate importance in the divine plan. We were the focal point around which God had constructed the entire universe. To question this arrangement was to question divine wisdom itself. The model had been perfected by ancient astronomers and endorsed by the Church as scientific truth that aligned perfectly with religious teachings about mankind's special place in creation. Working in his private observatory, the Polish canon spent decades meticulously tracking planetary motions and calculating orbital mathematics. His observations revealed troubling inconsistencies in the accepted model. The retrograde movements of planets created mathematical complexities that required increasingly elaborate explanations involving wheels within wheels and circular motions layered upon circular motions. A far simpler and more elegant solution emerged from his calculations. If the Sun occupied the central position with Earth and other planets orbiting around it, the mathematical complications vanished. Planetary retrograde motion became a natural consequence of Earth's own orbital movement, rather than an inexplicable celestial dance requiring divine intervention to maintain. But the canon understood the explosive implications of his heliocentric model. Publishing such ideas would invite charges of heresy and potentially fatal consequences. He guarded his manuscript for years, sharing it only with trusted colleagues who urged him to keep his revolutionary calculations secret. Only as death approached did he finally allow publication, never living to see the printed copy of his world-changing theory. The initial reaction was muted because the work appeared as the dying thoughts of an elderly cleric, rather than a serious challenge to established cosmology. The mathematical elegance was undeniable, but treating it as anything more than an interesting intellectual exercise seemed unnecessary. The real universe remained safely geocentric in the minds of authorities both scientific and religious. Then came an Italian mathematician whose personality was the complete opposite of the cautious canon. Where his predecessor had been diplomatic and careful, this new champion of heliocentrism was combative, arrogant, and equipped with a revolutionary new instrument that would shatter the old cosmic order forever. The telescope revealed a universe that bore no resemblance to the perfect, unchanging heavens described in traditional astronomy. The moon's surface showed mountains and craters, proving it wasn't the flawless sphere that theology demanded. Sunspots demonstrated that even the sun itself was blemished and changing rather than eternally perfect. Most devastating were the 4 moons discovered orbiting Jupiter. Here was undeniable proof that not everything in the universe revolved around Earth. If Jupiter could have its own satellite system, the geocentric model lost its fundamental assumption. The discovery of Venus's phases provided final confirmation that planets indeed orbited the Sun rather than Earth. Unlike his cautious predecessor, this astronomer published his findings in the common language rather than scholarly Latin. He wanted ordinary people to understand that the universe was far different from what authorities claimed. His writings combined rigorous observation with savage wit, making compelling arguments that demolished traditional cosmology, while entertaining readers with brilliant rhetoric. The response from established powers was swift and devastating. The Holy Inquisition recognized an existential threat to religious authority. If the Church could be wrong about the fundamental structure of the universe, what other doctrines might be questioned? The astronomer was dragged before ecclesiastical tribunals, threatened with torture, and forced to publicly renounce his own discoveries. Kneeling before his inquisitors, the elderly scientist formally abjured and cursed his own observations. He declared his lifework to be error and heresy, begging forgiveness for having disturbed the cosmic order with his blasphemous telescope. Legend suggests that as he rose from his knees, he muttered under his breath that regardless of forced confessions, the Earth continued its orbital motion around the Sun. The remainder of his life was spent under house arrest, forbidden from teaching or publishing his astronomical work. The suppression was thorough and backed by the full power of religious authority. Yet facts cannot be imprisoned indefinitely. Over the following century, accumulating evidence made the heliocentric model impossible to deny. The final vindication came through the mathematical work of an English physicist whose laws of universal gravitation provided the physical mechanism that earlier heliocentric theorists had lacked. Gravity explained not just why planets orbited the Sun, but how the entire cosmic system maintained its structure and motion. The universe was indeed heliocentric, and the mathematics proved it beyond any reasonable doubt. The institutional acknowledgement of error took centuries to arrive. The Catholic Church didn't formally admit its mistake until the late 20th century, nearly 400 years after condemning the astronomer whose crime had been accurately describing reality. By then, humanity had walked on the moon and sent spacecraft throughout the solar system, making the ancient geocentric beliefs seem almost incomprehensibly primitive. The next theory in our examination faced opposition from a different but equally powerful establishment. The medical profession of the mid-19th century operated under assumptions about disease that were not just wrong, but actively lethal. Doctors prided themselves on traditions and practices that were systematically killing their patients, while they remained convinced of their own expertise and dignity. Hospitals were places where people went to die rather than recover. Surgical procedures were performed in conditions of appalling filth, with physicians moving directly from dissecting corpses to treating living patients without any concern for contamination. The blood and gore accumulated on surgical coats were worn as badges of honor, symbols of experience rather than vectors of disease. Into this world of learned ignorance came a chemist, whose initial work involved solving problems in the French wine industry. His investigations into why some wine batches spoiled, while others remained pure, led him to discover microscopic organisms responsible for fermentation and decay. This revelation would eventually transform medicine, but first it had to survive the ferocious opposition of physicians who saw it as an insult to their professional competence. The chemist's germ theory proposed that invisible microorganisms were responsible for disease transmission. These tiny creatures could contaminate food, water, and medical instruments, spreading illness in ways that contradicted everything medical schools taught. The idea that prestigious physicians could be carrying death on their unwashed hands was not just scientifically absurd, but professionally insulting. Medical authorities rallied against this assault on their dignity and expertise. They had trained for years to understand disease through established theories involving bad air, bodily imbalances, and spontaneous generation of illness. The suggestion that invisible creatures were the real culprits seemed like superstitious nonsense, unworthy of serious consideration. The chemist responded with a series of carefully controlled experiments that demolished the theory of spontaneous generation. Using specially designed flasks that prevented airborne contamination while allowing air circulation, he proved that sterilized substances remained sterile indefinitely unless exposed to external microorganisms. Life didn't spontaneously appear from non-living matter, but required transmission from existing living sources. Despite this experimental proof, medical resistance continued until other researchers began applying germ theory principles with dramatic results. A Scottish surgeon started using carbolic acid to sterilize instruments and wounds, achieving miraculous reductions in surgical mortality. German researchers identified specific bacteria responsible for particular diseases, providing visual proof that germs were real and dangerous. The evidence became overwhelming, but acceptance was gradual and grudging. Medical schools slowly incorporated germ theory into their curricula, while older physicians continued practicing according to traditional methods. The transition took decades as established practitioners retired and were replaced by a new generation trained in the understanding that cleanliness and sterilization were matters of life and death. Today, germ theory forms the foundation of all modern medicine. Antiseptic procedures, antibiotic treatments, and vaccination programs all depend on understanding how microorganisms cause and spread disease. The chemist who was initially ridiculed for his invisible creature theory is now recognized as the father of modern medical science, whose insights have saved hundreds of millions of lives. The pattern continues to repeat throughout scientific history. Revolutionary ideas face systematic suppression, not because they lack evidence, but because they threaten established interests and conventional thinking. The next theory we'll examine challenged assumptions that seemed so obvious and fundamental that questioning them appeared to be a sign of mental deficiency rather than scientific insight. The rejection of meteorites as genuine celestial phenomena represents one of the most embarrassing episodes in the history of scientific arrogance. During the height of the Enlightenment, when rational thought was supposed to triumph over superstition, the most prestigious scientific institutions in the world categorically denied that rocks could fall from the sky. Their reasoning was impeccable according to the prevailing understanding of physics. Their conclusions were spectacularly wrong. The 18th century scientific establishment operated under the comforting assumption that the universe was a perfectly ordered clockwork mechanism. Newton's laws had revealed the mathematical precision underlying all natural phenomena. The heavens were pristine and unchanging, governed by predictable forces that left no room for cosmic debris randomly pelting the Earth. Objects simply could not materialize in the sky and plummet to the ground without violating fundamental principles of celestial mechanics. When peasants and farmers reported seeing fireballs streak across the sky, followed by thunderous explosions and the discovery of strange metallic stones, learned men dismissed these accounts as ignorant folklore. The French Academy of Sciences, representing the pinnacle of rational inquiry, declared such reports to be scientifically impossible. Rocks could not exist in the void of space, and even if they somehow did, they could not survive the journey through the atmosphere to reach Earth's surface. The testimonies of eyewitnesses were systematically discredited as hysteria, fabrication, or misidentification of natural phenomena. When unusual stones were found after reported fireballs, scientists explained them as ordinary rocks that had been struck by lightning or ejected from distant volcanic eruptions. The idea of extraterrestrial origins was not even considered worthy of serious discussion. This dismissive attitude persisted despite mounting evidence from credible observers across different countries and time periods. Ship captains, military officers, and educated citizens all reported similar phenomena, yet their accounts were filed away as curiosities rather than scientific data. The academic consensus was so strong that it seemed immune to contradiction by mere observational evidence. The first crack in this wall of denial came from a German physicist who committed an act of scientific heresy. Instead of dismissing folklore as ignorant superstition, he took the time to actually examine the historical record. He compiled hundreds of accounts spanning centuries, noting remarkable consistencies in the descriptions of fireballs, sonic booms, and recovered stones. The similarities were too precise and too widespread to be explained by mass delusion or cultural contamination. His systematic analysis revealed patterns that suggested a genuine natural phenomenon. The stones found after meteorite falls had distinctive compositions and structures that didn't match terrestrial rocks. They contained metallic iron alloyed with nickel in proportions never found in Earth-based materials. Their surfaces showed evidence of intense heating and rapid cooling that was consistent with high-speed atmospheric entry rather than lightning strikes or volcanic processes. But one man's careful scholarship could not overturn centuries of scientific orthodoxy. His book was largely ignored by mainstream researchers, who continued to maintain that extraterrestrial stone falls were physically impossible. The academic establishment had too much invested in their elegant model of celestial perfection to accommodate messy reports of cosmic bombardment. The breakthrough came when the sky fell on a French town in broad daylight before thousands of witnesses. The spectacle was too public and too dramatic to be dismissed as rural folklore. Multiple fireballs streaked across the sky in formation, producing thunderous explosions that were heard for miles. When the smoke cleared, over 3,000 stone fragments lay scattered across the countryside, still warm from their cosmic journey. The French Academy of Sciences could no longer ignore such overwhelming evidence. They dispatched their finest physicists to investigate what had become an undeniable scientific crisis. His meticulous report confirmed every detail of the meteorite fall and validated the extraterrestrial origin of the recovered stones. The academic world was forced to admit that their perfect, unchanging universe was actually a shooting gallery where Earth served as a constant target. The reversal was complete and humiliating. Phenomena that had been ridiculed as peasant superstition were revealed to be accurate observations of genuine natural events. The stones that had been explained away as lightning-struck rocks were actually samples of the solar system delivered directly to Earth's surface. Scientists who had dismissed meteorite reports as impossible were forced to rewrite their textbooks and acknowledge that the universe was far more dynamic and dangerous than they had believed. This pattern of institutional blindness would repeat itself when the next theory challenged humanity's understanding of cosmic history itself. The question of whether the universe had always existed or had experienced a moment of creation seemed safely resolved in favor of eternal stability. The cosmos appeared to be a steady-state system that had always been essentially the same and would continue unchanged forever. The challenge to this comfortable certainty came from an unlikely source. A Belgian physicist, who was also a Catholic priest, began working with Einstein's equations of general relativity and discovered something that even the great physicist found disturbing. The mathematics suggested that the universe was not static, but expanding. And if you trace that expansion backward in time, it led to an inconceivable conclusion. According to the calculations, the entire observable universe had once been compressed into an infinitesimally small, incredibly dense point of pure energy. This primordial singularity had then exploded outward in the ultimate cosmic explosion, creating space, time, matter, and energy in a single moment of creation. The priest called this the hypothesis of the primeval atom. A day without yesterday when the universe came into existence. Einstein's reaction was swift and dismissive. While acknowledging that the mathematical calculations were correct, he declared the underlying physics to be abominable. The idea of a cosmic beginning sounded too much like religious creation mythology to be taken seriously as scientific theory. It seemed to mix theology with physics in ways that made rational scientists profoundly uncomfortable. The opposition intensified when other researchers proposed alternative models that preserved the eternal universe concept. The steady-state theory suggested that new matter continuously appeared in space to maintain constant cosmic density as the universe expanded. This model eliminated the need for a singular moment of creation while still accounting for observational evidence of cosmic expansion. The debate became personal when one of the steady-state theory's leading proponents used a radio broadcast to mock the priest's creation hypothesis. He derisively referred to the primeval atom concept as a Big Bang, intending the phrase as an insult that would make the theories sound childish and unscientific. The name was meant to ridicule, but it stuck and eventually became the official designation for what is now accepted as the standard model of cosmology. For decades, the Big Bang theory faced systematic opposition from scientists who preferred the philosophical comfort of an eternal universe. The idea that everything we observe had emerged from nothing in a single moment seemed to violate basic principles of physics and common sense. Critics argued that the theory was untestable speculation, masquerading as legitimate science. The vindication came through accidental discovery by researchers investigating completely different phenomena. Radio astronomers trying to eliminate background noise from their equipment kept encountering a persistent signal that seemed to come from every direction in space. This cosmic microwave background radiation turned out to be the afterglow of creation itself, the faint remnant heat left over from the Big Bang that had cooled and stretched as the universe expanded. The detection of this primordial radiation provided undeniable proof that the universe had indeed experienced a moment of explosive creation. The steady-state model could not account for this uniform background glow that permeated all of space. The priest's abominable physics had been vindicated by the most sensitive instruments human technology could devise. Today, Big Bang cosmology forms the foundation of our understanding about cosmic history and structure. The derisive nickname intended to mock the theory has become synonymous with humanity's greatest insight into the origin and evolution of reality itself. The priest who dared to give the universe a birthday is now recognized as one of the most important cosmologists in history. The pattern continues with our next examination of how archaeological assumptions can blind researchers to obvious truths. For over 2 millennia, the greatest story ever told was considered nothing more than beautiful fiction by serious scholars. The tale of a 10-year siege, heroic warriors, and divine intervention was dismissed as pure mythology that had no connection to historical reality. The epic poem that inspired Western literature for centuries was treated as elaborate fantasy by 19th century historians who prided themselves on separating fact from fiction. The idea that such a magnificent city could have existed and been destroyed in a legendary war was considered naive romanticism, unsuitable for rigorous academic study. No serious scholar would waste time searching for a place that existed only in poetic imagination. Into this scholarly consensus stepped a German businessman whose obsession with ancient literature would revolutionize archaeology and vindicate the historical accuracy of humanity's most enduring story. His methods were crude, and his techniques would be considered destructive by modern standards. But his unwavering faith in the literal truth of ancient texts led him to one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in history. Using geographical descriptions from the epic poem as a literal treasure map, he identified a promising location that matched the topographical details described by ancient poets. Despite ridicule from professional archaeologists, who considered him a wealthy amateur playing at science, he began excavating a large hill that local traditions had long associated with the legendary city. What he found beneath layers of accumulated earth and debris exceeded even his own expectations. Not one city, but multiple settlements built on top of each other across thousands of years of continuous occupation. The archaeological evidence revealed a major Bronze Age metropolis that had indeed been destroyed by fire and warfare at precisely the time period when the legendary war was supposed to have occurred. The discovery transformed our understanding of ancient history and demonstrated that epic poetry could preserve accurate historical memories across millennia. The businessman who had been mocked as a treasure-hunting dilettante was revealed to be a visionary who had located one of archaeology's greatest prizes through careful reading of texts that scholars had dismissed as pure fiction. Our next theory faced opposition because it suggested that most of the universe was completely invisible to human observation. This seemed to violate the fundamental assumption that guided all astronomical research since ancient times. What you could see was what existed. The glowing stars, shining galaxies, and luminous nebulae represented the total inventory of cosmic matter and energy. The challenge to this obvious truth came from a Swiss astrophysicist whose calculations about galaxy clusters produced impossible results. When he measured the total mass of these cosmic structures based on their visible light output, the numbers didn't match the gravitational forces needed to hold them together. The clusters should have flown apart millions of years ago unless they contained far more matter than anyone could see. His solution was radical beyond imagination. He proposed that the universe was dominated by a completely invisible form of matter that didn't emit, absorb, or reflect electromagnetic radiation. This dark matter existed in quantities hundreds of times greater than all visible matter combined, making up the vast majority of cosmic mass while remaining utterly undetectable to conventional observation. The scientific community's response was predictably dismissive. The idea that 90% of the universe was invisible seemed absurd on its face. It was easier to assume that the calculations were flawed than to believe that astronomy had been studying only a tiny fraction of reality, while missing the bulk of cosmic matter entirely. The theory remained dormant for decades until other researchers began finding similar discrepancies in their own observations. Studies of individual galaxy rotation revealed that outer stars were moving too fast to be held in orbit by visible matter alone. The same invisible mass that seemed to surround galaxy clusters also appeared to permeate individual galaxies in vast, unseen halos. Today, dark matter is recognized as one of the fundamental components of cosmic structure, even though its exact nature remains mysterious. The universe we observe through telescopes represents merely the luminous foam floating on an invisible ocean of unknown matter that shapes the evolution and distribution of everything we can see. The final theory in our examination involves one of medicine's most tragic episodes of institutional resistance to life-saving knowledge. In the obstetrics wards of Vienna's most prestigious hospital, women were dying at horrific rates from a mysterious fever that struck shortly after childbirth. The mortality statistics were so appalling that pregnant women begged to be treated anywhere else rather than submit to the care of the hospital's most highly trained physicians. A young Hungarian doctor working in the hospital became obsessed with solving this deadly mystery. The pattern was undeniable and inexplicable. Two maternity clinics operated within the same facility under identical conditions, yet one had mortality rates 5 to 10 times higher than the other. Women would literally give birth in the streets rather than enter the deadlier ward. The difference seemed impossible to explain through conventional medical understanding. Both clinics used similar procedures, occupied comparable facilities, and treated the same population of patients. Yet one ward was a death trap, while the other was relatively safe. The young doctor investigated every conceivable variable from birthing positions to religious practices, finding nothing that could account for such a dramatic disparity in outcomes. The breakthrough came through personal tragedy, when a close colleague died after suffering an accidental scalpel wound during an autopsy. The symptoms that killed his friend were identical to those experienced by the dying mothers. This horrific parallel sparked a revolutionary insight that would challenge the very foundations of medical practice. The doctor realized that the high-mortality clinic was staffed by physicians and medical students who routinely performed autopsies on cadavers before moving directly to examine living patients. The safer clinic was run by midwives who had no involvement with dissection or autopsy procedures. The connection seemed obvious once recognized, but it contradicted everything medical schools taught about disease transmission. Without understanding bacteria or infection mechanisms, the doctor theorized that physicians were carrying some form of cadaverous particles from corpses to living patients. He instituted a mandatory hand-washing protocol using chlorinated lime with mortality rates dropping by 90% almost solution before any patient contact. The results were immediate and dramatic, overnight. Rather than celebration, this breakthrough provoked fury from the medical establishment. The implication that distinguished physicians were carriers of death was seen as a profound insult to professional dignity. The idea that educated gentlemen could have dirty hands was not just scientifically absurd, but socially unacceptable to the medical hierarchy. The doctor's statistical proof was dismissed as coincidence, while his theory was ridiculed as unscientific speculation. Medical authorities refused to adopt hand-washing protocols and eventually drove him from the hospital entirely. His increasingly desperate attempts to promote life-saving hygiene practices were met with professional ostracism and personal destruction. The tragic irony reached its culmination when the doctor died from the very type of infection he had taught the world to prevent. Blood poisoning from an infected wound killed him at age 47, just 2 weeks after being committed to an insane asylum. He became a martyr to the stubborn pride of an establishment that preferred maintaining dignity over saving lives. Only after germ theory gained acceptance decades later did the medical world recognize their catastrophic error. The man they had destroyed was posthumously honored as the savior of mothers, a pioneer whose insights could have prevented countless deaths if institutional arrogance hadn't blocked their implementation. The hand-washing protocol he championed became standard practice, transforming surgery from a death sentence into a healing art. Our final examination involves perhaps the most spectacular example of scientific denial in the face of overwhelming evidence. For centuries, Western explorers returning from Africa brought tales of massive, powerful apes that walked upright and possessed human-like intelligence. These accounts were systematically dismissed as folklore by European naturalists who considered such creatures impossible. The scientific consensus was clear and unshakable. Large primates were already known through specimens of chimpanzees and orangutans. The idea that even larger apes existed without proper scientific documentation was considered preposterous. Such significant animals could not possibly remain undiscovered in an age of systematic biological classification. The stories were lumped together with mermaid sightings and sea serpent accounts as obvious exaggerations or misidentifications of known species. European scholars assumed that isolated African populations were simply embellishing descriptions of familiar apes to impress gullible visitors. No serious zoologist would waste time investigating obvious myths. The breakthrough came when an American missionary working in West Africa decided to take local accounts seriously rather than dismiss them as primitive superstition. He examined skulls and bones that clearly belonged to an unknown primate species, far larger and more robust than any catalogued ape. The physical evidence was undeniable, even though living specimens remained elusive. These 10 theories reveal a disturbing truth about scientific progress. The greatest breakthroughs weren't delayed by lack of evidence, but by institutional pride, economic interests, and the simple human tendency to reject uncomfortable truths. Each discovery faced the same pattern of ridicule, suppression, and eventual vindication, often arriving decades too late to save the careers and lives destroyed in the process. The next time you hear about a revolutionary idea being dismissed by experts, remember these stories. Sometimes the most important truths are the ones that powerful institutions least want to hear. Science advances, not despite authority, but often in spite of it. What revolutionary discoveries might be facing suppression right now, waiting for their moment of vindication?